When I'm working, whether on the drawing board or at the typewriter, or as in particularly in the last week or two, because it seems to be the lecture season, I've been working almost solidly on the light table, but it's really much the same kind of thing. I very often have visions of people in my mind to whom I'm addressing whatever I happen to be doing. I've often said this before, that one will sort of almost give oneself a nudge and imagine a certain person in the room and say, this will amuse you, or this will upset you, or this is for you, or do you remember that conversation we had? And I think no better than on this particular occasion when one is desperately wishing for those more conversations, carrying on from those conversations which one had with Alvin. And I think that it's absolutely correct and apt that the city conversation is the one which perhaps all of us had most often. And there may be even slightly embarrassing moments over the next 35 minutes when I may dare to almost mimic Alvin's comment, or at least, I hope, hint to you that there would be an Alvinism. Come on. Would be, I think, the most frequent, come on, Peter, for Christ's sake. Particularly when one was using one of one's own personal loves, which may well have not been his. I could imagine him this evening probably not liking most of the things I'm about to show because they are not of his taste. And I think it will soon emerge that this is why I have titled it An Ideal City, is that it's skirting around the question of the ideal city. If one is any kind of collector and regurgitator at all, one has at the back of one's mind some kind of strange mixture, some kind of strange collage. The other thing that I should say before really launching in is that this particular event here, I've seen so many faces and personalities, many of whom have been the people that one has been making the private nudge. And there's this extraordinary collage, particularly I would mention those that have come from very extraordinary places and extraordinary time, that Glenn Small suddenly turns up from Los Angeles, or that Per Cartvet, of course, turns up from Oslo, or that Leon comes from the other side of the world, and that Colin Fournier comes from somewhere, we don't ever quite know where, but it's actually just across in Paris, and that these are also the people to whom one is making the nudge and the wink and the funny squiggle, or in the process of selecting slides on the light table, one says, no, I'll keep this in because I think old so-and-so will be in the audience. And I think Alvin would have enjoyed that, and he would probably have had, in his lexiconic manner, he would have probably guessed who they were directed to even before I did myself on the light table. So what I'm going to talk about is an extremely personal thing, though the examples will be taken, as it were, from my own sketchbook and from places half remembered, and even some places that are typical, but not the exact example I would need. Imagine, therefore, that I'm describing an ideal city in a way that I would like to live in, or that I would like to create, or that I would like to create parts of. And of course it doesn't exist, but it does exist, because many of these places do exist. In my ideal city, therefore, I have to say straight away, not only do I have a kind of sympathy and intrigue for what Leon has just been talking about, the other side, and in fact, Melbourne is one of my favorite world cities for a very particular reason, that it has marvelous restaurants in it. Don't know what else, he didn't talk about that, but for me, it goes almost to just hovering behind Strasbourg. It's one of the best places in which to eat, but that's me. I can't support its architecture particularly. I'm very much, and this came up earlier, I'm very much a child of the north. I get extremely nervous south of the Alps, as most of you will know. And so I suppose my ideal location for my city might be somewhere hovering around on that map, not only because it is very definitely in the northern band, and I can remember Dalibor and I have had several conversations on the subject of the fact that he has his origins in what he calls the valley culture, and I have my origins in what I call the North Sea culture. And I guess as you get older, you become to play the part. You begin to actually seek out the things that are of the valley or of the North Sea, or seem to satisfy your own particularization of culture. So I would imagine my city to be somewhere where there is a lot of water, but that ideally it is, as in this neck of the woods, it is on the bottom part of the map anyhow, where it is water which is traversed by cultures that come from quite a long distance away, that there is Leningrad seeping through that series of channels at the same time as there is Newcastle and Boston and Amsterdam seeping through the same channels, that in a sense, and it leaves certain pieces of itself on the ground. Ideally, therefore, it is a waterlogged city where, in this rather bad slide, and deliberately bad slide, one can't quite tell whether certain things are ships, and certain things are islands, and certain things are bridges, and certain things are scratches on the slide, and certain things might be buildings. And it's very different then from something like an ideal city in a special place with a single vision. It's also very different from the most extreme moment of citydom as one passes a bridge in New York. Many of my close friends will know I'm always extremely nervous in New York because I suffer from a very particular kind of high-rise phobia. I get extremely... I had the other day to collect $1,000 from a publisher if I went to floor 40 in a bank. It was only something around the sum of $1,000 that would get me up there. And I was extremely pleased to have the money in $100 notes at the bottom of the elevator. And yet, to cross that bridge, or one of the bridges, probably not this one actually, because it doesn't link to the other one, to cross that bridge and to come away from it is a most electric moment. So I suppose my ideal city has to have some aspect of that. It has to have some aspect of the danger and the intensity and the quantity of friends as represented in that city that we see on the picture. But ideally, it's somewhat smaller. I think 2 million is a very good size of a city and is waterlogged and water-hogged, and that one moves through the water. I was delighted that somebody else, I can't remember who, mentioned the notion, it was Bernard, in fact, who mentioned this concept of the three-dimensional city. It's been one of the things bugging me for years. I think that there must have been at least 2 or 3 conversations with Alvin on the subject of the three-dimensional city, and somehow or other I think he would have used it to reinforce his tremendous adoration of Chicago, which incidentally is a city I don't like at all. The notion of the waterlogged city has bugged me, and occasionally one has tried to respond to it. Nobody's ever built buildings over canals, not more than the odd little sliver of building, not whole buildings where the other favorite preoccupation, which is with the arcade, has combined with the preoccupation for the canal. I don't know why not. And that if you are a child of the North Sea, you will know that the raunchiest buildings, those which come nearest to that ideal of the archigram period for the building that moved and did things and opened its heart and its mouth and its entrails and dropped things down, and even the thing it drops things down into floated and went away and was like a building on the move. This can be found even in its decayed state around the North Sea. I can't even remember which city this is, and it doesn't really matter, and I think it's actually Bristol, which isn't, strictly speaking, on the North Sea. But it leads one directly onto the notion that in one's ideal city there have to be buildings that transmogrify, that aren't, strictly speaking, animals, nor are they buildings, nor are they ships, and that there are strange conditions of them, which perhaps might be very ordinary conditions, but might be rather extraordinary conditions, where these different objects, which we so conveniently package into different categories of our mind and different categories of the operation of designing, and certainly different categories of association, might actually become part of the same business. That in my ideal city, the boats and the buildings and the waterways and the roads and the trees and the toy dogs and the stuffed dogs are the same. In an ideal city, therefore, one might enjoy and mark these things. There's a particular city, I doubt whether Alvin ever went there, it's not his kind of a place, called Gothenburg, which did a marvelous thing. And I would love to borrow a certain aspect of Gothenburg, and then to put my own kind of rubbish around it. I would like to borrow Gothenburg, which has a canal system, somewhat more generous. I guess it came later and was dug in different conditions to that of Amsterdam, which it marks in a very particular way. It would be a marvelous city that combined this marking of the waterways and this marking of the percolations with, at the moment when the thing is about to fragment the most, that is to say when two pieces of waterway come together at a corner, it actually has the most extraordinary outcrops of building. And in Gothenburg, this happens perhaps at a slightly more modest level. That at these corners, your eye is always pulled on towards these extraordinary markers, all of them different. And one could imagine the mixture of this slurping thing and that hard marking thing together in one's ideal city. One could imagine Kitagawa beckoning you on to yet another canal, perhaps. And the collaged corner is something which I think the ideal city of mine needs. If today is a kind of collage, and if many of us, and unfortunately the great introducer of the collage conversation didn't make it today, we thought at one point that he might, that St. Basil's, after all, is the ultimate naughty building that collages these extraordinary things together. Beckoned round the corner are buildings in Gothenburg that have extraordinary insides. This, which I will just for once mention the name of the architect, is a guy called Hans Hedlund. Rather good name for somebody doing things on crowds of corners. Have extraordinary insides, which perhaps was common in other cities at that period of time. One should never be surprised about corners, and just at the moment when you think that you are so pleased with marking your corners and moving towards them, then, in a sense, an ideal city should start to trick you, just as you have this sense of reassurance and sense of hierarchy as you're heading towards this corner and this reassuring special object. It should explode you and perhaps pirouette you around a successive series of corners. It should take you round and then not let you escape. It should move you around and suck you in. What a tragedy that this was pulled down less than 2 years after it was built. It should suck you in and move you on. And then just when you get used to the notion that a corner must be a total thing with a certain sort of message, what about a no-corner corner? A corner that is two corners or isn't there? In an ideal city, it must be tolerated. And it must be tolerated that perhaps those things not only should fall apart, but should prepare themselves to explode. And it should prepare you for the experience of architecture almost remembered. And it should prepare you for corners that are very clever in their technique. And it should draw you in. I move, in a sense, from corners to the question that the city is is several things. The city is, of course, what you understand it to be from your own experience, whether it is, as many of us experience far too many cities in our lives, from the airport to the Sheraton, from the Sheraton to the university lecture hall, back to the Italian restaurant, back to the Sheraton, and back to the airport. But in fact, if we have a little more time, if they're 4-day cities, and often I can remember some conversations with Alvin as well as others as to what cities were 2-day cities, 8-day cities, 3-day cities, and so on. But in my ideal city, there is a city that always has things that you will never enter. I can remember a conversation about the late Warren Chalk and Dalibor Vasily walking down a very short street around the corner from here, which was that Warren was able to disappear, or Dalibor rather, was able to disappear in even a 3-house street. And he must have had somewhere to disappear into. I think that an ideal city is full of things that can be read as part of the total system, can be read as part of your own personal preference system, the street you never go down because it's windy, the street you like to go down for other reasons. And buildings that you will never enter, but that you would love to be tantalized into entering. The tantalization can be part of the whole game. Isn't it extraordinary that certain cities are so uncertain of their current kind of cultural situation that they only permit certain things to happen in the cheap suburbs, and wait another 10 years before those architects are allowed to do things in the slightly less cheap suburbs? There is a kind of tyranny of certain great cities as well. That there must be pomposity in an ideal city. There must be special occasions and doors that are rather difficult to enter. And there must be doors where every piece of gambitry, particularly the crude, is being used to entice you within. Or where the aperture is almost an incidental to the extraordinariness of the total project. Or where the door to entice you within is virtually an entrail in the three-dimensional city. Or where the door, in my ideal city, there would have to be doors like this too, where even the experience of even minimally contemplating going into that door would be an extraordinary business, and to climb up it, daunting. Or where the door is part of a kind of crevice game, where the door is so bizarre and so naughty and so silly. The mind's imagination of what might lie behind, in fact, is much more exciting than what does lie behind. Or the door as an incidental. Great favorite of mine, this one, because I had to pass it by for 3 months. And I would choose to pass it by. And it's a very simple door, just with a lantern, which should give clue as to where its origins lie. Not far off that map, in fact on that map. Or, and Rem did it so much better, or the banality of going in. The business of going in reduced to a piece of pastiche. Or where the door is a tongue licking you into what must be an extraordinary condition, also from the north. One of the few times that I have almost literally bumped into Peter Eisenman was as he was coming in and we were going out. And I think the notion of a city that is prepared at something like 98% occupancy to have a hotel sitting at the feet of these extraordinary skyscrapers that make the Sydney waterfront has a hotel that is very small indeed. One of the great old Alvin conversations was about the room. There's no room in London, Peter. There's no room. But there are rooms, and there's I think one of the best conditions of room, very dingy slide, are those conditions of room where you can go and not do anything, and as long as you look expensive, nobody will ask you why you're there. They are usually hotel lobbies, or as in this Madrid case, it's a hotel lounge which has a circular seat that goes around, and the whole of Madrid comes through, and you can simply sit there, use the beautifully appointed gents, and leave, and the degree of urbanity that permits this, whereas, of course, as soon as you go into sort of Hicksville, hundreds of people rush at you and ask if you want a sandwich or, tell you where the bar is. An ideal city, there are many places which, if you have the neck, or even if you don't have the neck, it emerges. George Immendorf's vision of the city is somewhere where you can go and have a good time, or even a vicious time. Session. Because there's that very essential of an ideal, particularly any kind of city that you would wander around in with Alvin, or any of the rest of one's friends, which would have to have bars and places with mirrors. Apropos a couple of lectures I was doing the last few days, the thing seen indirectly being infinitely more fascinating and more telling than the front. And in a way, it's a situation that goes way beyond style or preferred style, the kind of thing that makes this sort of bar beautifully photographed goes out of fashion, and perhaps it moves to this kind of bar which has nostalgia for other sets of people. And I guess the other thing that most of us enjoy doing and must do in our ideal city is to speculate upon the kinds of scenarios that might go on in such a room, particularly, let's say, a photograph like this where there's nobody actually there. And you start thinking of your favorite people who you would like to be there, pockets from this room itself. I would love to sit them in that cafe. One of them sitting in the third row probably uses that cafe, who knows? And the overheard conversations. Now, one can say that perhaps this sort of thing exists also in a village pub, but there's a particular way in which, in an ideal city, it will be used by those who frequent, but it will also always and very relaxedly be used by those who've simply come to that city for the first time. In my ideal city, there will be rooms, Alvin, sometimes which don't bear any resemblance to the nice or the bourgeois or the correct or the okay architecture, which will be nautitecture. There will be special things that are perhaps almost like playthings. Some of you may have noticed that already, and it will happen 2 or 3 times more, that Itsuka Hasegawa's work serves as a model. Sometimes there will be mimicry of one city for another. And I was putting this slide in because at the time I thought Arata Izazaki would be here. There was an occasion when Christine Hawley and I were in Japan, and he sent us to a special theatre, and we had these very special tickets, and we went on a long train ride to a theatre, and we thought that it was going to be an extremely serious cultural event. And it was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and it turned out to be this extraordinary song and dance theatre of entirely girl choruses. I think an ideal city has to tolerate such things. It has to more than tolerate it, it has to breed them. The irony is that in this particular case, this particular type of theatre, the name of which escapes me, was actually bred in the middle of nowhere in Japan, but it was, I know, repeated in Tokyo. It was borrowed by Tokyo. In an ideal city, there will also be quite shocking rooms, quite strange rooms. Doesn't matter from which period. And in an ideal city, it will be tolerated that two men, or any number of people, of very special talent and very erudite comment, who have spent a day of the most intense conversation and discussion upon special things, will be ferreting in a waste bin for a nub end, for a cigarette end. In an ideal city, this must be a very natural thing to happen. I told Dalibor I'd work it in somehow. And in an ideal city, there will be strange people coming who hitherto had only been heard of as sort of mysterious myths, and borrowed and mixed. This was probably the most extraordinary event, and I think Peter was there, Peter Eisenman, when the New York Five hit town with an exhibit at ArtNet. And there should be, of course, in my ideal city, 100 ArtNets and nets and meshes and hutches and whatever. Or there should be silly places where one can go and do silly things. Of course, all my friends in Japan say, well, of course, you know, the most important intellectuals go and play pachinko because it clears their minds. It's complete bullshit. They go there because they like it. And there should be rooms where very strange people do extraordinary things. This is the man who, in fact, designed the building with the egg on the corner, Masaharu Takasaki. There should be 100 or 200 Masaharu Takasakis, and they should not be preserved, but at least a smile should be arisen on their face. If a man who has lost his wife and lost his building in the same half-year period can still smile and can still wrap himself up, making extraordinary things in an extraordinary room, and carry on, then that isn't a bad city. And there should be, of course, the continued and, in fact, highly developed, much more developed than any of the next few slides get near to, of the there and not there, and the better and the worse, and the great extraordinariness in the north of the night. If one thinks of that map with which I started, the great cities of that region enjoy their lanterns and their perhaps they have cheap electricity, yes, but they enjoy their lanterns, that at night the lanterns come alight and perhaps create an architecture better than the architecture of the day. And I think we're only scratching, even in the end of the 20th century, scratching that. And that's a conversation I would love to have with Alvin about the scratching of the surface of the night city. And if you're a person who finds some cities uncomfortable, as one does with those with the high-rise claustrophobia, nonetheless you can still come out at night, because there's certain aspects that can be edited away. Or in other situations there can be normalcy that can be edited up. I wonder if you recognize the building by now. It's not actually from the north, it's of course the Centre Beaubourg, which occasionally such a thing can be brought to a very high state of art, albeit that it's in fact rather small, and albeit that the model so far is outside the station at Yokohama. But it can be brought to an extraordinary state of art, far beyond the mere, almost one-dimensional graphicism of something like this. And it can act as a source of inspiration, this whole issue of lanternization. Where else but in the north could one start to really work at such an idea, that the lantern might become the building? Where else that in Japan might people start working at the idea of the building not only as an extraordinary three-dimensional collage, but also changing itself even in its presence. Where else but from the north could one start thinking of the east returning to its lantern origins? And there is Chicago, actually, though a special Chicago, because here I'm really still talking about the city of light. An ideal city uses its light and its water and then puts the light across the water and through the buildings. An oldie where I think nearly all the authors of this particular scheme happen to be sitting in this room. That's a lovely one. You'd like that. Where one's search for the three-dimensional city all too soon gets trapped into making a singular monument. But if one starts to bend the material, even material upon which one has worked in the past, you can start to get back to an ideal situation. If you use it on its side or on its head or back to front or ill-lit or more lit, one starts to get the kinds of hybrids which inevitably are part of my ideal city. In a way, though, this project was drawn for a particular part of Berlin. In a sense, it was a giveaway that I chose a very negative part of Berlin, a very hitherto unloaded part of Berlin. And that in the back of my mind I was thinking of these other places. Even of things like that as source material. And in the day, the lanterns turn into something else. And in the day, in my ideal city, there is an inevitable mixture of the English suburban and the French bourgeois cultures. How that, you might ask? And in my ideal city, there would have to be the extremely bland. There would have to be the extremely boring as well. In amongst the fruit, one wants there to be things, the simplicity and banality and ordinariness of which almost make your hair stand on end. The nearest, and it's a bad slide I see, the nearest I ever got to that was in the front of this particular building. The nearest sometimes that I ever got to that was when another architect played with one's initial ideas. The nearest I sometimes have got to that is where one hasn't been concentrating upon the actual compilation of the objects into the city, but certainly into their mixture. Parts of my ideal city you see through the window of a train. This is in an English city that I don't even want to commit the name of it to my memory. I'd rather not know where it is, because I only saw it once through the window of the train. And it's remained for many years an essential component. Whereas in a sense, this, which has many similarities, if you like, because it is now talked about and written about, and we have to write about it ourselves, becomes too loaded as soon as it becomes an architectural piece. And in a sense, as soon as you see the extremely tedious town that surrounds it, it is slightly more difficult to use as a component. But as a component it must be. In my ideal city, walking becomes very important. I too don't drive a car. I too am making constant remarks from the back seat or the side seat. The observer sees the best of the game, he says somewhat selfishly. Therefore, one's preoccupation for many years with gadgets that might transport you, even from those days through to these days. And one's partial detachment from the objects that actually do transport you in the three-dimensional city. A detached fascination with hints of the three-dimensional city. But the three-dimensional city does exist. I've forgotten the caption to this. I don't know which city this slide comes from. And again, for my purposes, I don't really care. We're talking about an ideal city. Sometimes the model or the drawing of a piece of work actually has gone further than the built condition. I've never seen the Hong Kong and Shanghai built. I prefer to think of it in these terms. Hinted at in these terms. The three-dimensional city as a sliver, and there Rem had the view, I think, from the top. The jaws, I suffer from a sort of agoraphobic fear of heights so much. This is the only building I've been in that whereby standing in the middle of the inside, I start to suffer from it, which means that John Portman has got me somewhere from the wrong way round. But in my ideal city, there also have to be very special rooms, back to that room conversation, very special rooms that might be contrived in ways that we hadn't hitherto expected, or that go beyond, in a certain way, even the suggestions of people like Lebbeus Woods, or go beyond even the position that Christine and I were speculating on when she had designed and I had modelled the shadow house. Back to that building with the dropped eyelid, which is in many ways one of the most city buildings I've ever been in. It's Clorindo Testa's bank, now a very unfashionable building by its date, but an extraordinary building by its ability to be a room. It takes the corners of the street. It brings that crossing of the street in as a room. It also has exquisite and extraordinary spaces within, but that's, by the way, the eyelid drops and the city comes in. It really, believe me, it really works. In an ideal city, that will happen. And the images and the memories inevitably start to be mixed. My favorite things start coming together, whether they're my own favorite things or favorite things such as that corner in Berlin that one passes by many times. They become layered. And the water, of course, is always passing through them somewhere. The original inspiration for this coming from one's childhood, from spotty photographs in black and white, seen of buildings pulled down before one's birth. The space probes collected by Warren Chalk, therefore, in a way, are very special and also exist as an extreme edge of one's ideal city. They too are possible if you start to filter them together. Back to the man with the egg in the small room, who perhaps had the audacity at a particular moment, 3, 4, 5 years ago, to pull such things together. A man who listened to me lecture in Buenos Aires and gave me a slide, and probably did give me his name, but I've lost it, I think was thinking along these lines as well. And in the end, Ron, who's also sitting here, I think understands this notion of the ideal city. Perhaps for him the ideal city lives somewhere between those two very pungent conditions. For me, the ideal city has flippy-floppy edges. Many would say this is something to do with one's seaside origins. For me, the ideal city is always on the move, or is always casual. But behind the casualness, there is, of course, one's curious English predilection for the tatty. Even though one pulls the tatty together and formalizes it and returns to that formality. and hangs the tatty on the nearly disciplined. In my ideal city, the tatty and the tacky and the wayward and the casual and the nonchalant and the cosmetic are hung on each other, and there are still elements of discipline, even if the discipline is a ticky-tacky thing itself. And it's gawky and hanging and animal-like. My ideal city has not only water passing through it and an infinite number of tentacles, but it's animal-like in some way that I still haven't quite discovered. And sometimes tracks back to near normalcy, the first stages of this particular set of drawings. I tried to draw like I am Pei, and then worked back to the cactus. But the cactus, that such a thing does exist. My God, it does exist in a corner, in another favorite, but not yet ideal city. If you can imagine somehow, though, that this is there too, that the backs and the fronts, that old conversation that I remember James Sterling, when he was still working with James Gowan, used to talk about, that the backs were the truly generic part of the English attitude towards building, that they were the parts that really mattered. There's still something of that in all of this, that those old funny 1910 London backs are actually lying behind this, and certainly lying behind this, that the bit to watch is the little red objects where you disappear to and do naughty things and let the wind come through and let the mist go up. And essential to my ideal city is that somewhere behind it can be perceived very special things, just out of the city, but drunk in by the inhabitants of the city. And silly things, and small things, and even that danger for both the Danes and the English of the picturesque, of course, of the second-rate picturesque. And that you can dangle things in amongst the trees and have strange things through the trees and with the trees and of the trees. And finally, then, the irony of this, it's all very well to abstract, but somebody might say, well, now you guys, at last you build. What do you do of that ideal city? And so one imagines the next stage through the... not there yet. Blown it. 2 more slides there should be. Oh, great. As one... this is a very difficult bit to vamp, because it's... As one looks through from the building that Christine and I made in Lutzerplatz of Berlin, at the moment, if you look across the street, you see Matthias Ungers's thing with the gables. But perhaps one needn't. Perhaps one would look, can we do the last one? And see some manifestation of that other city happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I've got a note and a feeling that the day has gone on for 5.5 or 6 hours, and the other room has said, it's probably time to bring it to a close. And I feel that there may still be some people who very much want to say something, so I will allow at least 1 or 2, if you're absolutely intent on it, to come up and speak. Otherwise, I think I should bring the evening, the day to a close. But let me at least give someone the opportunity to say something. Well, then, I will end the day by thanking the speakers for coming and thanking a lot of the people who've known Alvin for his 20 years here and more, and particularly, of course, the Boyarsky family, Nicholas, Victoria, and above all, Elizabeth, who was, of course, always very much behind Alvin's presence here and allowing it to happen. Thank them all, particularly. And say, as Alvin would have said, let's all go to the bar and have a drink. Good evening.